"This isn't a battlefield," the alien sergeant scoffed. The Deathworld girl quietly proved him wrong. The floor moved before anyone said a word. I felt it in my knees first, a tremor that did not belong in a training hall built from clean metal and soft blue light. Around me, 20 cadets from a dozen worlds stood frozen, waiting for someone to tell them what to do. I did not wait. I dropped low, grabbed the edge of a bench, and pulled a boy named Daniel Cole down beside me, half a second before a ceiling panel came loose and swung on its cable like a broken pendulum. "Down," I said. Just that. One word. He stared at me, like I had spoken a language he did not know. Around us, alarms began to scream, and the lights switched from blue to a flickering red that painted the whole hall in short, ugly bursts. This was supposed to be a simple orientation exercise. Nobody had told me that orientation here meant standing in a room while the ceiling pretended to fall on you. I am Mara Voss, and 3 weeks earlier I had been standing in a field outside my grandmother's house, watching the sky turn a color that meant we had less than an hour before the storm hit. Now I was light years from that field, inside a floating academy that trained soldiers for a galaxy that had, as far as I could tell, mostly forgotten what real danger felt like. The panel above us finished its swing and cracked against a support column with a sound like a gunshot. The sparks rained down in a lazy arc. Somewhere behind me, a cadet with pale green skin and too many fingers was making a high, thin sound that I would later learn was his species' version of screaming. Then, just like that, the lights turned back to blue. The alarms cut off. A voice came over the speakers, calm and slightly amused, announcing that the exercise was complete and that everyone could return to their seats. I looked around. Half the room was still crouched on the floor. A few cadets were holding on to each other. One had fainted, or maybe just gone very still, and 2 of his squad mates were fanning him with their hands. I stood up, brushed the dust off my knees, and helped Daniel to his feet. He looked at me with wide eyes, like I had just done something impossible. "You didn't even flinch," he said. "It was a loose panel," I said. "It wasn't even on fire." That was the moment Sergeant Threll Vaknash walked in. He moved like someone who had never once needed to run for his life. Tall, gray-skinned, with a face built for calm authority, he surveyed the room the way a teacher looks over a set of test papers before grading them. His uniform was pressed so perfectly that it looked painted on. He was, I would learn later, one of the most decorated instructors in the entire Coalition Joint Defense Academy, a veteran of exercises and simulations that were considered legendary among cadets who had never actually seen real danger. His eyes swept across the room, taking in the fainted cadet, the shaking hands, the 2 humans other than me who were pale but standing. Then his gaze landed on me, and he frowned, like I did not fit the picture he was building in his head. "Cadet Voss," he said, reading my name off a small screen in his hand. "You are aware this was a level 1 calibration test, the mildest we run." "I am now," I said. A few cadets laughed nervously. Threll did not. "Most species require months of conditioning before they can remain upright during a level 1 event," he said, more to the room than to me. "You barely reacted." "There wasn't much to react to," I said. "It was a panel and some noise." I watched something shift behind his eyes, something between irritation and disbelief. He looked down at his screen again, scrolling through what I assumed was my file. I already knew what it said, because I had seen it myself during intake. No combat record, no formal training, no medals, because Earth did not hand those out to 19-year-olds who had simply grown up on a planet that occasionally tried to kill them. "Where is your service record, cadet?" he asked. "I don't have one," I said. "I'm not a soldier, I'm an exchange cadet. My planet doesn't have a large standing coalition force yet." "Then explain to me," he said, his voice dropping into something colder, "how a cadet with no formal combat experience remained calm during an exercise that reduced 3 trained officers to tears." I could have explained. I could have told him about the summer the ground cracked open 2 towns over, or the winter the power grid failed for 11 days straight, or the fire that took half our valley when I was 12, and how my whole family spent 3 nights sleeping in a truck because the house was not safe. I could have told him that where I come from, a loose ceiling panel and a red light were not considered an emergency, they were considered a Tuesday. Instead, I just said, "I don't know, I guess I've seen worse." He studied me for a long moment, the way you might study something that does not fit inside a box you built for it. Then he made a small, dismissive sound, somewhere between a laugh and a sigh. "This isn't a battlefield, cadet," he said, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "This is a simulation of measured, civilized conflict, designed to prepare officers for coordinated engagement, not to entertain fantasies of survival instinct. Whatever happened on your world, it has no bearing here. I suggest you take training seriously, rather than relying on luck." A few cadets snickered. I felt my face go warm, not from embarrassment, but from something closer to quiet frustration. I did not argue. Arguing with a man like that, in front of a room full of strangers, was not going to change anything, so I nodded once, said nothing, and sat back down. That night, in the small metal room they gave me, I lay on my bunk and stared at the ceiling, the real one, bolted down and unmoving, and thought about home. About the smell of smoke before a wildfire, about the sound wind makes right before it turns into something that tears roofs off houses, about the way my grandmother used to check the sky every morning, like it was a stranger who might turn on her without warning. I thought about Threll's face when he said the word luck, like it was something dirty, like the fact that I had survived things he could not imagine made me less capable, instead of more. The next morning, I found out he had filed a report. I was not supposed to see it, but a cadet named Lucy Bennett, a quiet girl from a mining colony who had become something like a friend over the last few days, showed it to me on her screen during breakfast. It was short. It said that I displayed low aptitude for structured aggression and combat coordination, and that my calm response during the calibration test was likely due to a lack of proper threat recognition rather than composure. It recommended reassignment to logistics or support roles, where my apparent inability to feel appropriate fear would not put a unit at risk. I read it twice. Then I handed the screen back to Lucy and finished my food. "That's not fair," she said. "You were the only one who didn't panic." "It's fine," I said, and I meant it, mostly. "He doesn't know what he's talking about. He'll learn." She looked at me like she wasn't sure whether to believe me. I wasn't entirely sure myself, but there was something steady in my chest, something that had been there since the first time I watched a storm roll in over the hills as a child and realized that fear was a choice, not a fact. You could feel it and still move. You could feel it and still think clearly. My whole life had taught me that panic was a luxury for people who had somewhere safe to run to. Where I grew up, there was no safe place to run to. There was only the next decision, and the one after that, and the one after that. Later that day, our squad was assigned a basic tactics simulation, a virtual exercise meant to test coordination under mild pressure. Threll ran it personally, standing at the control console with his arms folded, watching us through a wall of glass like we were animals in an enclosure. The simulation put us in a mock structure with simple objectives: move from one end to the other, avoid marked hazard zones, work as a team. It was, by any measure, an easy exercise. Most of my squad moved through it with a strange, deliberate carefulness, calling out every step, freezing at sounds that were clearly just background effects. I moved differently, not recklessly, but efficiently. I read the room the way I had been taught to read a landscape back home, without even realizing I was doing it. Where's the exit? Where's the cover? What sound doesn't belong? I noticed the fake hazard zones before the markers even lit up, just from the way the simulated air seemed to shimmer near them, the same way heat shimmers over dry grass right before it catches fire. I said almost nothing during the exercise. I did not need to. I moved, and the others followed, mostly because nobody else seemed sure of what to do, and I clearly was. When it ended, Threll's voice came over the intercom, flat and unreadable. "Cadet Voss." A word. I walked to the control room, aware of the eyes following me. Threll did not look up from his screen right away. When he finally did, his expression was unreadable, somewhere between curiosity and suspicion. "You didn't speak much during that exercise," he said. "There wasn't much to say," I said. "The path was clear enough." Most cadets require verbal coordination to succeed in a squad exercise. "I guess I don't," I said, and immediately regretted how it sounded. Too blunt, maybe even proud. But it was simply true. Where I came from, you learned to read the world around you, because sometimes there was no time to explain what you saw. You just moved, and the people who trusted you moved with you. Threll's eyes narrowed slightly, and for a moment I thought he might say something sharp. Instead, he simply turned back to his screen and said, without looking at me again, "Return to quarters, cadet." I left without another word, but I could feel his eyes on my back the whole way out. That night, Lucy found me in the common room, staring out a window at the slow turn of a distant moon. "He filed another report," she said quietly. "I figured he would." "It's not bad this time," she said, surprised. "He wrote that your instincts appear unusually developed for someone without formal training, and that further observation is warranted." I almost laughed. It was not an apology. It was not even close to respect. But it was, for the first time, a question instead of a dismissal. And questions, I had learned a long time ago, back on a world that never stopped testing the people who lived on it, were where everything eventually started to change. I did not know yet how soon that change would come, or how much it would cost. But standing there, watching the moon crawl slowly across a sky that was not my own, I understood something with total clarity. Sergeant Threll Vocknash believed he understood danger because he had studied it, simulated it, graded cadets on how well they performed inside its careful, padded edges. He had never actually needed to survive it. I had, and somewhere deep down, in the part of me that still remembered the taste of smoke and the sound of a house groaning under a weight it was never built to hold, I knew that the real test had not even started yet. The alarm came without warning, 3 days after Threll's second report, and this time it was not part of any schedule I had seen. I was in the middle of a meal when the lights in the dining hall shifted from their usual soft white to a deep amber, and a voice announced that all cadets in my year group were to report immediately to the Deathworld Stress Calibration Wing. Around me, forks stopped moving. A boy across the table, a lean, nervous cadet named Ethan Blake, went pale. "Nobody told us there was a test today," he said. "There never is," I said, standing and gathering my tray. "That's usually the point of a test." We were led into a long gray corridor by 2 instructors who would not answer questions, then through a set of heavy doors into a chamber I had not seen before. It looked, at first glance, like an ordinary training room, wide and open, with a raised platform along one wall where the instructors would observe. But something about the air felt different, heavier, the kind of stillness that comes right before something happens. Threll stood on the platform, arms folded, flanked by 2 other instructors I did not recognize. He looked down at us with the calm, faintly bored expression of a man about to demonstrate something he had demonstrated 100 times before. "This is a Deathworld stress calibration," he announced, his voice carrying easily across the room. "For most species in the Coalition, danger is something studied, not lived. Your bodies are not built to expect sudden threat. This exercise exists to measure how you respond when the unexpected happens, so that we can properly train that response out of its raw, unhelpful form and into something structured and useful." I glanced at Lucy, standing beside me, her hands already tightening at her sides. On my other side, Daniel Cole shifted his weight nervously, glancing toward the exits like he was already calculating how far they were. "The scenario you are about to experience is fully simulated," Threll continued. "No cadet will come to actual harm. However, your bodies will not know that. Pay attention to what your instincts tell you to do. then understand why those instincts are often wrong. He said the last part looking directly at me, and I understood exactly what kind of demonstration this was meant to be. The lights dropped to black. For a moment, there was nothing, no sound, no light, just the low hum of the room's systems and 20 cadets breathing too fast in the dark. Then, without warning, the floor lurched beneath us, a violent, grinding shudder that threw 2 cadets off their feet. A deep groaning sound rolled through the walls, the unmistakable sound of something structural giving way, and a section of the ceiling above us cracked open with a shower of sparks and simulated debris. Cadets screamed, not the polite, controlled alarm of people running a drill, but real, ragged screaming, the kind that comes from somewhere primal. Ethan Blake dropped to the floor and curled into himself, hands over his head. Lucy grabbed my arm so hard it hurt, her whole body shaking. Around us, the room's systems escalated. A pressure alarm began to wail, a warning that the simulated atmosphere was venting, and a cold wind rushed through the chamber, carrying with it a chemical smell designed to trigger the scent memory of danger. Somewhere in the dark, something large moved, a shape with too many limbs, and a low, rumbling growl, a simulated predator projected with enough realism that half the room scrambled backward into each other. I felt my heart rate climb, the same way it always did when danger was real. But underneath that, something else took over, something quiet and familiar, a part of me that had been trained not by an academy, but by a life spent on a world that did not care whether I was ready. I saw the ceiling section falling and calculated its arc without thinking, the same way I once judged which direction to run when a burning tree began to lean. I saw the venting pressure alarm and immediately located the nearest sealed alcove, the way I once knew, from years of drills at home, exactly which room in our house had the thickest walls. I saw the simulated predator's shape and understood, almost instantly, that it was moving in a pattern designed to herd us toward a specific exit, not to actually reach us, the same way real predators back home would test a herd before committing to a chase. "This way," I said, my voice low but steady, and grabbed Lucy's sleeve, pulling her toward the alcove. "Ethan, get up, now." He did not move. He was frozen, curled on the floor, eyes wide and unseeing, lost somewhere inside his own fear. I crouched beside him, gripped his arm firmly, and spoke close to his ear, the way I used to speak to my little cousin during storms when she was too scared to move. "Look at me," I said. "Not at the room, at me." His eyes found mine, wild but focused. "We're going to walk to that wall together," I said. "Just walk, I've got you." Something in my voice must have reached him, because he nodded, shaking, and let me pull him upright. Together, the 3 of us moved along the wall, staying low, avoiding the open center of the room where the simulated hazards were concentrated. Around us, other cadets were scattered in various states of panic, some frozen, some running blindly into each other, one pressed flat against a wall with his hands over his ears. I did not think about what I was doing as heroic. It did not feel that way. It felt like the most obvious thing in the world, the same instinct that made you pull a sibling away from a collapsing riverbank, or guide a neighbor's child indoors before a storm hit. You saw someone in danger, and you moved to help them, because the alternative was unthinkable. I reached a cadet named Grace Miller, a broad-shouldered girl from an aquatic world who was normally one of the calmest people in our year, now pressed against a support column with her hands shaking uncontrollably. "Grace," I said, keeping my voice level, "follow the wall. There's an alcove 10 meters down. Come on." She looked at me like I had spoken through a fog, then nodded and pushed off the column, following close behind us. The simulated predator let out another low growl, closer now, and the projected shape lunged toward a cluster of cadets near the center of the room. Someone screamed. I did not look back. I had already noted, from the pattern of its movement, that it would not actually reach them, that the simulation was designed to frighten, not to make contact. but knowing that intellectually did nothing to calm the instinct screaming in my chest, to help anyway, so I called out, loud and clear, cutting through the noise. "It won't reach you if you keep moving. Head for the walls, now." A few cadets actually listened, breaking from their frozen positions and stumbling toward the edges of the room. I did not know if it was my words or simple herd instinct that moved them, but it did not matter. What mattered was that they moved. By the time we reached the alcove, we had gathered 6 cadets total, huddled together in the narrow, relatively sheltered space while the chaos continued in the main chamber. Ethan was still shaking, but his breathing had slowed. Lucy had stopped gripping my arm so hard it hurt, though she had not let go entirely. Grace stood with her back against the wall, eyes closed, taking slow, deliberate breaths. "Just a little longer," I said, though I had no way of knowing how long the exercise would last. "It's not real. Whatever happens, it's not real." I said it as much for myself as for them, because some quiet part of my mind, the part shaped by years of actual storms and actual fires and actual nights spent unsure whether morning would find our house still standing, could not fully separate the simulated fear from the real thing. Fear does not always know the difference between rehearsal and reality. It simply responds. After what felt like a very long stretch of chaos, the room lights snapped back to their usual soft white, the alarms cut off, and the projected predator dissolved into nothing. The groaning ceiling sealed itself silently, the vents stopped their cold wind, and the chemical danger smell faded into the ordinary recycled air of the academy. Silence settled over the room, broken only by the ragged breathing of 24 cadets slowly realizing it was over. I looked around. Most of the room was still on the floor, or pressed against walls, some crying quietly, a few simply staring blankly ahead, still caught somewhere inside the fear the simulation had built so effectively. Threll and the other instructors were watching from the platform, and for the first time since I had met him, Threll's face did not hold its usual calm certainty. He looked, instead, faintly stunned. He had, I realized later, expected everyone to freeze equally. That was the entire design of the exercise, to demonstrate that raw instinct was chaotic and unhelpful compared to trained coordination. Instead, he had watched 6 cadets, myself included, move through the chaos with purpose, guiding others, calling out clear directions, reaching safety without a single command from the instructors above. He stepped down from the platform and crossed the room toward me, his expression unreadable. Around us, medical staff were beginning to help the more shaken cadets to their feet. "Explain what just happened," he said, his voice quieter than I had ever heard it. "I don't know what you mean," I said, though I understood exactly what he meant. "You directed 6 cadets to safety during an unscripted panic event," he said. "You identified the safest structural point in the room within seconds. You calmed a cadet who was, by every measure we have, in a state of complete psychological freeze. None of that was in your training." "No," I agreed. "It wasn't." "Then where did it come from?" I looked around the room, at Ethan sitting against the wall with a medic checking his pulse, at Lucy, watching me, with an expression somewhere between awe and worry, at Grace slowly uncurling from the position she had folded herself into. "Where I come from," I said carefully, "the ground actually does that sometimes. Not a simulation, the real thing. Buildings actually fall, storms actually come without warning. We don't get alarms that tell us it's not real, because it always is." Threll said nothing for a long moment. He simply studied me, the same way he had studied his own screen days earlier, like a man trying to fit an unfamiliar shape into a box that no longer seemed to hold it. "You said, during the calibration test, that you had seen worse," he said finally. "I did. I assumed that was an exaggeration." "I know," I said. "Most people here do." He looked around the room one more time, at the cadets still recovering, at his own instructors exchanging uneasy glances on the platform, and then back at me. "I need to reconsider some things," he said quietly, almost to himself, and walked away without another word. I did not know it yet, but that was the moment everything began to shift, not because he had suddenly decided to respect me, but because for the first time he had allowed himself to wonder if the box he had built around what danger meant was simply too small to hold the truth. That night, back in my quarters, I sat by the window and thought about home again, about my grandmother checking the sky every morning like it was something that might turn on her, about the way fear had never once been a luxury I could afford to indulge. I did not feel proud of what happened in that room. I felt, mostly, tired and a little sad that it had taken something so frightening to make anyone here understand what I had always known. But somewhere beneath the tiredness, there was something else too, something steady and quiet, the same feeling I used to get after a storm passed and the sun came up over a valley that had survived one more night. It was not triumph. It was simply the quiet certainty that whatever came next, I would be ready for it, the same way I had always been ready, whether anyone believed me or not. The first sign that something was wrong was the smell. We were 2 hours into the joint field exercise, deep inside a mock structure built to resemble a damaged outpost, when I caught a sharp, metallic scent in the recycled air that had no business being there. I had grown up close enough to old machinery and controlled burns to know what overheated metal smelled like, and this was not the clean, sterile air of a simulation. This was real. I did not say anything at first, because I was not certain, and because Sergeant Threll had made it clear, more than once, that I was not to interrupt a live exercise with unverified concerns. So I kept moving with my squad through the corridor, rifle loaded with training rounds, alert but calm, the way I had learned to be during every drill since the calibration test. This exercise was different from the others. It was the largest joint operation the Academy had run all year, combining cadets from 6 different worlds into mixed squads, moving through a massive constructed facility meant to simulate a disabled coalition outpost under threat. Simulated hazards were everywhere: falling debris, pressure leaks, projected hostile forces, but all of it was supposed to be carefully controlled, buffered by layers of safety systems that made sure no cadet ever faced anything more than a convincing illusion. Daniel Cole was on point ahead of me, moving with more confidence than he had shown weeks earlier, calling out clearances as we passed through each junction. Lucy walked just behind me, her rifle steady now, in a way it had not been during our first exercises together. Grace Miller anchored the rear, watching our backline the way she had been trained to. We turned a corner into a wide chamber meant to represent a central processing hub filled with tall equipment racks and catwalks overhead. The lighting flickered once, then steadied. Somewhere above us, a mechanical groan rattled through the structure, longer and deeper than anything I had heard in a training exercise before. "Command, this is Squad 4. I heard our instructor say over the comms, his voice carrying the first thread of genuine concern I had heard from him all day. "We're reading a structural fault in Sector 7. Confirm this is scripted." There was a pause. Too long a pause. "Squad 4, hold position." The response came back, tight and clipped. "We are investigating a system anomaly." That was the moment I knew, with total certainty, that whatever was happening was not part of any script. The lights above us cut out entirely, plunging the chamber into darkness for one long, terrible second before the emergency lighting kicked in, casting everything in a harsh, uneven red. The mechanical groan above us grew sharper, and then, without warning, one of the massive equipment racks along the far wall tore loose from its mounting and crashed down onto the catwalk beneath it, sending a shower of real sparks and real debris across the chamber floor. Someone screamed. This time, the sound had a different quality to it than anything in the calibration test, a rawness that came from genuine, immediate fear rather than a triggered instinct, because this time it was real. "Everyone down," I shouted, dropping low and pulling Lucy with me as a piece of twisted metal skidded across the floor where she had been standing a second earlier. "Get away from the racks, now." Our instructor's voice crackled over the comms again, but the words were lost in a burst of static. Somewhere further down the corridor, an alarm began to blare, a real one this time, the deep, ugly tone reserved for actual facility emergencies rather than training scenarios. "Command, we need a full stop," I heard someone shout over the open channel, panic clear in their voice. "This isn't scripted." Repeat, "This is not scripted." Around me, the chamber had descended into chaos. Cadets who had been moving with practiced confidence only moments earlier were now frozen, disoriented, unsure whether to trust their training or their instincts, caught in the terrible gap between the two. A cadet near the fallen equipment rack was pinned beneath a section of twisted metal, calling out weakly, his voice tight with pain. I recognized him. Ethan Blake. I did not think. I moved. "Lucy, Grace, get everyone toward the far exit," I called, already crawling low across the chamber floor toward the fallen rack. "Watch the ceiling. If anything else groans like that, get clear." "Mara, wait." I did not wait. There was no time to wait. I had learned, a long time ago, that waiting for someone else to act was a luxury that disasters did not grant you. You moved, or you did not, and the difference between those two choices was sometimes the entire difference between someone living and someone not. I reached Ethan and assessed the situation the way I had been taught to assess a fallen tree or a collapsed section of fence back home, quickly, without panic, looking for the safest way to shift the weight without causing further harm. The metal pinning his leg was heavy, but not impossibly so, angled in a way that suggested it could be levered up rather than lifted straight. "I'm going to move this," I told him, keeping my voice steady even as the alarm continued to wail around us. "It's going to hurt. I need you to stay still and let me do the work." He nodded, teeth gritted, sweat beading on his forehead. I found a length of broken support bar nearby and wedged it beneath the fallen section of the rack, using it as a lever the same way I had once helped free a neighbor's truck from a collapsed section of muddy road. I pressed down with all the weight I had, felt the metal groan and shift, and Ethan cried out as he pulled his leg free, dragging himself back with his arms while I held the lever steady. The moment he was clear, I let the metal drop and turned to check him. His leg was bent at a wrong angle below the knee, and he was pale, breathing fast, but conscious and clear-eyed. "You're okay," I said, though I could not promise that with certainty. "You're going to be okay." Behind me, the chamber had not settled. Another groan rolled through the structure, deeper this time, and a section of the ceiling near the far wall began to buckle inward, sending a fine rain of debris down onto the catwalk below. Cadets scattered, some screaming, some frozen in place, staring upward like they could not quite believe what they were seeing. I heard Sergeant Threll's voice then, sharp and commanding, cutting through the chaos as he entered the chamber from the corridor behind us. For a moment, some part of me expected him to take charge instantly, to demonstrate the calm, structured authority he had spent the entire term insisting was the only proper response to danger. Instead, I watched him freeze. It was only for a second, maybe two, but I saw it happen, saw the moment his body, trained for measured exercises and careful simulations, encountered something entirely unscripted for the first time in longer than he probably wanted to admit. His eyes went to the buckling ceiling, to the scattered cadets, to the alarm still blaring its ugly, real tone, and for that brief moment, he simply did not know what to do. Then the ceiling gave way entirely. A section of support beam crashed down near the chamber's central junction, and Threll, caught mid-step as he moved toward the panicking cadets, was clipped by a falling piece of debris and thrown hard against a support column. He went down heavily and did not immediately get back up. "Sergeant!" someone shouted, but the chamber was in full chaos now, cadets scattering in every direction, some helping each other, most simply trying to find the nearest exit. I looked at Ethan, still pinned by pain but stable, then at Lucy and Grace, who had gathered a cluster of cadets near the far exit and were guiding them out in a controlled line. Then I looked at Threll, lying against the base of the column, one arm pinned beneath a piece of fallen debris, his face tight with pain, but his eyes open, watching the chaos around him with an expression I had never seen on him before. I made my choice without hesitation. I crossed the chamber at a low crouch, avoiding the worst of the falling debris by instinct, reading the pattern of the structural failure the same way I once read the pattern of a wildfire's spread, watching which sections groaned before they fell, which ones held steady a moment longer. I reached Threll and knelt beside him, quickly assessing the debris pinning his arm. "Don't move," I told him. "Let me look." "Cadet Voss," he said, his voice tight. "This is not the priority. Get the others to safety." "They're already moving," I said, already working the debris free with the same careful, mechanical patience I had used on Ethan. "You're the priority right now, because you're the one who's stuck." He did not argue further, though I could see it cost him something to accept help rather than direct it. I freed his arm carefully, checking it was not broken, before helping him sit upright against the column. "Can you walk?" I asked. "I believe so," he said, though his face was pale. "Then let's go. This section isn't stable." I helped him to his feet, and together we moved toward the exit, pausing once when another groan rolled through the ceiling above us, waiting for the sound to settle before continuing, the same instinctive pause I had learned from years of listening to buildings and trees and hillsides tell you, in their own creaking language, exactly how much longer they intended to hold. We reached the corridor just as emergency response teams arrived, flooding the space with real medical personnel and safety officers, their presence a strange, almost surreal contrast to the panic that had gripped the chamber only minutes earlier. Ethan was carried out on a stretcher, conscious and already managing a shaky, relieved smile. Lucy and Grace stood near the exit with the rest of our squad, accounted for, shaken but whole. Threll leaned against the corridor wall, cradling his injured arm, and looked at me with an expression I could not immediately name. It was not gratitude exactly, not yet, and it was certainly not the dismissive certainty he had carried since the day we met. It was something quieter than either of those. It looked, more than anything, like a man confronting the uncomfortable possibility that everything he believed about danger, about training, about the difference between simulation and reality, had just been proven incomplete. "You knew," he said quietly, once the corridor had settled and the worst of the emergency response had moved past us. "The moment we entered that chamber, you knew something was wrong." "I smelled it," I said. "Overheated metal doesn't smell like a training exercise." None of the sensors flagged an anomaly until the structural fault began. "Sensors are built to catch what they're programmed to look for," I said. "Where I'm from, you learn to trust your senses first, because sometimes the warning system fails before the disaster does." He was quiet for a long moment, watching the medical teams move past us, watching Ethan disappear down the corridor on his stretcher, watching Lucy and Grace comfort a shaking cadet from another squad. "I have spent my entire career believing that instinct without structure is chaos," he said finally, almost to himself. "That real skill comes only from training, from repetition, from carefully controlled exposure to danger in measured doses." "Maybe that's true, for some people," I said, "but where I come from, there's no measured dose. There's just the world, doing whatever it wants, whenever it wants, and you either learn to move with it or you don't survive long enough to learn anything at all." He looked at me then, really looked, in a way he had not since the day we met. "This isn't a battlefield," he said quietly, almost like he was testing the words, seeing if they still fit the way they once had. "No," I agreed. "It isn't. Not yet." He did not answer that, but something in his expression told me he understood exactly what I meant, and that for the first time since I had arrived at the academy, he was beginning to wonder what would happen the day it finally was. 3 days after the incident in the equipment chamber, I was called into a review room I had never seen before, deep in the administrative wing of the academy, to answer questions about what had happened. The room was small and formal, with a long table and a panel of officers I did not recognize, along with the academy commandant, a stern-looking officer named Nathan Price, who had a reputation for saying very little and missing even less. I sat across from them, hands folded, and answered their questions carefully, describing the smell of overheated metal, the moment the lights failed, the decision to free Ethan Blake from the fallen equipment rack, and afterward, the decision to help Sergeant Threll. "You made several command-level decisions during that incident," Commandant Price said, studying a screen in front of him, "without authorization and without formal combat training." "There wasn't time to wait for authorization," I said. "People were in danger. I did what needed to be done." "That is precisely the concern," he said, though not unkindly. "Instinct without structure can save lives in one moment and cost them in the next. We are still investigating the cause of the structural failure, but early findings suggest a maintenance fault, possibly worsened by an unrelated system error. It could have been far worse." "I understand," I said, "but it wasn't worse, because people moved when they needed to." He studied me for a long moment, then finally nodded, some of the sternness in his face softening. "Sergeant Vaknash has submitted a report recommending commendation for your actions," he said. He was quite thorough. I confess, it surprised me, given his prior assessments of your aptitude. I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing. The investigation continued for another week, quietly, without much involving me directly. I later learned that the structural fault had indeed been an accident, a poorly maintained support system that had failed under stress it was never properly tested against, though there were quiet murmurs among the instructors that something about the timing was unusual enough to warrant closer scrutiny. Nobody ever told me definitively what caused it, and in the end, it did not change what had happened, or what I had learned about myself in the middle of it. What changed, in ways I had not expected, was Sergeant Threll. He requested a meeting with me privately, in his own office, a small, spare room lined with awards and commendations from a career built entirely on measured, careful exercises. His arm was still in a light support brace from the injury, though he no longer seemed bothered by the pain of it. "Sit, please," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. I sat. He did not speak immediately, instead studying his own hands for a long moment, like he was gathering words that did not come easily to him. "I have reviewed the footage from the incident several times," he said finally. "Along with your prior training records, the calibration test, the tactics simulation, I find myself needing to reassess several conclusions I made about you when we first met." "Okay," I said carefully. "I called you unqualified," he said. "I suggested your composure came from a lack of proper threat recognition rather than genuine skill. I was wrong." I did not respond right away, mostly because I had not expected him to say it so plainly. "Where I come from," he continued, "danger is something we choose to study. My homeworld has not experienced a natural disaster in recorded memory. No predators higher than pest level exist in our ecosystem. Our weather is regulated by systems so old and so reliable that most citizens have never once needed to seek shelter from it. War, when it happens, is something we train for as an intellectual and physical discipline, never as a lived necessity." "That sounds nice," I said, and meant it. "It is," he said, "but it left me with a very narrow understanding of what real danger requires of a person. I built my entire career on the assumption that measured exposure and careful structure were the only path to true competence under pressure. I dismissed your composure because it did not fit inside that structure. I was arrogant to assume that structure was the only valid path." He looked up at me then, and for the first time since we had met, his expression held something close to humility. "Tell me about your world," he said. "Truly, not the summary in your file." So I told him. I told him about the wildfire that took half our valley when I was 12, about the 3 nights my family spent sleeping in a truck because the smoke made the air inside our house too dangerous to breathe. I told him about the storm that knocked out our power grid for 11 days, and how my grandmother had taught me, calmly, patiently, exactly how to ration water and food and fuel without ever once raising her voice, because panic, she always said, never once put out a fire or fixed a downed power line. I told him about the earthquake that cracked the road 2 towns over, about the years my community spent rebuilding, about the drills we ran every season, not because we enjoyed them, but because the ground beneath our feet had taught us, again and again, that safety was never something you could take for granted. I told him that where I came from, fear was not something you trained out of your body through careful, measured exposure. It was something you lived beside, every single day, until it became simply another part of how you moved through the world, no different from breathing. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "I understand now why the calibration test meant nothing to you," he said finally. "It was not that you lacked fear, it was that your fear had already been shaped by something far larger than anything we could simulate." "That's part of it," I said, "but it's not the whole thing. I think the bigger part is that where I'm from, you learn that panic doesn't help anyone. It feels natural, but it's actually the least useful thing you can do in a real emergency. So you learn, early, to feel the fear and keep moving anyway. Not because you're brave, because you don't have another option. That is a form of bravery," he said quietly. "Perhaps the truest form." I did not argue with him, though privately, I still was not sure I agreed. Bravery, to me, had always sounded like something chosen, something noble. What I had grown up with felt more like simple necessity, the kind of quiet, unglamorous endurance that nobody back home would have thought to call heroic. It was just how you survived. "I would like to request your reassignment," Threll said then, and I looked up, surprised. "To logistics?" I asked, remembering his earlier report. "No," he said, something almost like a smile touching the corner of his mouth. "To my own command track. I believe the Coalition has spent generations training officers to handle danger as an intellectual exercise, carefully staged and controlled. I believe we are due for an uncomfortable but necessary reckoning with what danger actually requires of a person when the careful structure fails, as it did 3 days ago, and as it may again." "You want me to teach that?" I asked. "I want you to help me understand it well enough that I can teach it properly," he said. "And yes, eventually, I believe you should teach it as well, alongside me. Your instincts, your composure, your ability to move and think clearly under real, unscripted pressure, these are things that cannot simply be simulated into existence. They must be understood, respected, and where possible, cultivated in cadets who have never faced anything like what your world demanded of you." I sat with that for a long moment, thinking of my grandmother checking the sky each morning, of the years spent learning to read a landscape for danger, the way others read a book, of the quiet, unspoken lessons that had shaped me long before I ever set foot on this academy. "Okay," I said finally, "I'll help, but I want to be clear about something." "Go on." "I'm not special because I'm braver than anyone here," I said. "I'm not special at all. Every single person on my world grows up learning what I know. It's not a gift, it's just what happens when your home never stops testing you. I don't want anyone here to think I'm some kind of exception. I want them to understand that this is simply what it means to come from where I come from." Threll considered that for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted again, settling into an understanding that seemed, finally, to reach all the way down. "Perhaps that is the most important lesson of all," he said quietly. "Not that you are exceptional, Cadet Voss, but that an entire world of people like you exists, quietly capable of things this coalition has never had to imagine needing." He extended his hand then, the human gesture slightly unfamiliar on him, a small effort at respect I understood without needing to be told. I shook it. "Welcome to my command," he said. I left his office that afternoon, feeling something I had not expected to feel after everything that happened, something lighter than triumph, quieter than pride. It was simply the sense that, for the first time since arriving at the academy, I had been truly seen, Not as a diversity placement, not as an anomaly to be dismissed or explained away, but as exactly what I was, a person shaped by a world that never once made survival easy, walking quietly among people who had never needed to learn what I already knew in my bones. I did not know yet what that would mean for the cadets who would come after me, the ones who would arrive at this academy carrying the same easy assumptions Threll once carried, looking at someone like me and seeing nothing worth respecting. But I understood, walking down that corridor with the weight of his handshake still warm on my palm, that something important had shifted, not just for me, but for an entire institution that was only now beginning to understand what it truly meant to prepare for danger, rather than simply study it from a comfortable distance. The new intake arrived on a morning bright enough that the whole training yard seemed washed in gold, and I was standing near the entrance with a data pad in hand, checking names off a list, when I heard the laugh. It was not a cruel laugh, not exactly. It was the kind of laugh that came from simple disbelief, the sound a person makes when they see something that does not match what they expected. I looked up to find a tall cadet with sharp blue markings across his face, a species I recognized from a world known for its rigorous, disciplined military tradition, staring at me with an expression I remembered very well. "You're the instructor?" he asked, glancing at the data pad in my hand, then back at my face, like he was checking for some sign he had misunderstood. "I am," I said. "Mara Voss. I'll be running your Deathworld preparedness track this term." "No offense," he said, though the words that followed suggested he intended exactly that, "but you don't look like someone who's seen real combat. I read your file. No formal medals, no listed engagements." 6 months had passed since the day Threll shook my hand in his office. 6 months of quiet, steady work, rebuilding an entire section of the Academy's curriculum around lessons that had never been taught here before. Lessons about reading danger with your senses instead of your sensors, about moving through fear instead of waiting for it to pass, about the difference between studying a threat and having survived one. In that time, I had grown used to this particular look, the mixture of confusion and dismissal that came from someone meeting a person who did not match the shape of authority they expected. I did not answer right away. I did not need to. "Cadet," came a familiar voice from behind me, calm and even, carrying the same quiet authority it always had, though it no longer held the certainty it once carried about what danger truly meant. "This isn't a battlefield, not yet." Sergeant Threll Voknash stepped up beside me, his arm long-heeled, his uniform as pressed and precise as ever, though something in the way he carried himself now was different from the man I had first met almost a year earlier. "But if it ever is," he continued, looking directly at the young cadet, "you had better pray you have someone like her standing next to you when it happens. Because I promise you, whatever training you received before arriving here, it did not prepare you for what she already knows in her bones." The cadet's confident expression faltered, just slightly, the same way mine once had when I first met Threll and felt the sting of being dismissed without being understood. I recognized the look, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. "Sergeant," he began, "I didn't mean—" "I know exactly what you meant," Threll said, not unkindly, but without softening the point either. "I meant the same thing, once. I learned the hard way that meaning it does not make it true." He turned to me then, and something in his eyes carried an old memory, the quiet acknowledgement of two people who had both learned something important the hard way. "Carry on, instructor," he said, and walked off toward the administrative building, leaving me standing with a dozen new cadets who were now looking at me with considerably more caution than they had a few minutes earlier. I did not need caution from them. I needed understanding, and understanding, I had learned over the past 6 months, could not be demanded. It had to be built, patiently, the same way you built trust with a wary animal or a frightened child, one honest moment at a time. "Let's begin," I said, setting the datapad aside. Not with a lecture, with a walk. I led them out past the training yard, past the sleek buildings and careful gardens of the academy, to a section of open ground the coalition had set aside years earlier for terrain exercises and largely forgotten since, overgrown with wild grass and scattered rock formations that had never been fully cleared. It was, by galactic military standards, an unremarkable patch of land. To me, it looked almost like home. "Tell me what you see," I said, gesturing to the landscape. The cadets exchanged confused glances. The tall cadet with the blue markings, whose name I had learned was Owen Hart, finally spoke. "Grass," he said. "Rocks. Nothing dangerous." "Look again," I said, slower this time. They studied the landscape with more care, though most of them still saw nothing but an ordinary field. I let the silence stretch, giving them time, the same patient silence my grandmother used to give me when she wanted me to notice something on my own, rather than simply being told. "There," said a quiet cadet near the back, a girl named Sophie Turner, pointing toward a section of ground where the grass grew in a slightly different pattern, darker and denser than the surrounding field. "The ground looks different there." "Good eye," I said. "That's likely a drainage channel, probably filled with water after a heavy rain, hidden just beneath the surface growth. Step on it wrong during a real emergency, in the dark, moving fast, and you could twist an ankle or worse, exactly when you can least afford it." I walked them through the rest of the field slowly, pointing out the subtle signs most of them had never been taught to notice. The way certain rock formations suggested unstable ground beneath, the way the wind moved differently near a hidden depression, the way birds scattering suddenly from a particular section of grass could signal something moving through it that you could not yet see. "None of this is combat training," I told them, once we had circled back toward the academy buildings. "This is something more basic, and honestly, more important. Before you can ever fight properly, you need to be able to simply survive the world around you, in its ordinary, unscripted form. Combat is something you train for and hope you never need. Survival is something the universe asks of you constantly, whether you are ready or not." Owen Hart, walking near the front of the group, glanced back at me with an expression that had softened considerably since our first exchange that morning. "Is it true," he asked, "what the sergeant said, about what you know?" I considered the question carefully before answering, because I wanted to be honest with him in the way I wished someone had been honest with me on my very first day here. "I'm not special," I said. "That's the first thing I want all of you to understand. I grew up on a world that never stopped testing the people who lived there. Wildfires, storms, power failures, the ground itself sometimes cracking open without warning. Nobody where I'm from is given a medal for surviving a bad season. It's simply what growing up looks like there. Every single person on my world carries some version of what I carry. I'm not exceptional. I'm ordinary, for where I come from." "That doesn't sound ordinary to me," Sophie said quietly. "I know," I said. "That's exactly why I'm standing here, teaching this course. Not because I think any of you are less capable than me. I think, given the same childhood I had, every one of you would have learned exactly what I learned. The problem isn't ability, it's exposure. Most of you have simply never needed to develop these instincts, because your worlds, thankfully, never demanded it of you. That's not a weakness. It's a kind of grace, honestly, one I sometimes envy. But it does leave a gap, and my job is to help you fill that gap before the day comes when the universe decides to test you anyway, without asking first whether you feel ready." The cadets were quiet for a moment, absorbing that, and I let the silence sit, the same patient silence I had learned to trust over the past year. Later that evening, after the new cadets had been dismissed to their quarters, I found Threll waiting near the edge of the training yard, watching the sun sink slowly behind the distant hills of the academy grounds, painting the sky in long streaks of orange and violet. "You handled that well," he said, without turning to look at me. He wasn't wrong to be skeptical, I said, coming to stand beside him. I would have been too, in his position. A file with no medals doesn't look like much. "A file is a poor measure of what actually matters," Threll said. "I learned that lesson from you, though I suspect it cost you more to teach it than it should have. I thought about that for a moment, about the long road from the day he first dismissed me in front of a room full of strangers to this quiet evening, standing beside him as something closer to an equal than I ever expected to become. "It's all right," I said finally. "I think some lessons only really land when they cost something to learn. If you'd simply believed me on the first day, would you have understood it the same way you do now?" He considered that, then shook his head slightly. "No, I do not think I would have." We stood together for a while, watching the sky darken, the first few stars beginning to appear over a world that had never once, in its long history, needed to fear the ground beneath it or the sky above it. It was, I thought, a strange kind of privilege, one I did not begrudge them, even as I understood it, left a gap that someone eventually needed to fill. "Do you ever miss it?" Threll asked quietly. "Your world, despite everything it put you through?" I thought about the smell of smoke drifting over a valley at dusk, about my grandmother checking the sky each morning with the same patient wariness she brought to everything, about the quiet, unglamorous resilience that had shaped every person I grew up alongside, the kind that never once considered itself brave, simply necessary. "Every day," I said, "it's not an easy place to grow up, but it teaches you something most people here have never had the chance to learn. That fear doesn't have to stop you. That the ground can shake, and the sky can turn dangerous, and the world can ask more of you than seems fair, and you can still find a way to keep moving, calmly, clearly, without losing yourself to the panic of it. I don't know if that makes my world better or worse than this one. I just know it made me who I am." Threll was quiet for a long moment, watching the stars continue to emerge over the peaceful academy grounds, a place that had never known true danger, and, if people like Owen Hart and Sophie Turner learned their lessons well, might never truly need to. "He said this wasn't a battlefield," I said quietly, almost to myself, thinking back to the very first day I arrived here, to the dismissive certainty in Threll's voice, to the quiet frustration I had swallowed, rather than argued. He wasn't wrong. This academy, this coalition, this entire peaceful stretch of the galaxy, none of it is a battlefield, not yet, and maybe, if we do our jobs well, it never fully will be. But nobody ever asked what I call home," I continued, watching the last light fade from the sky. "Nobody ever asked what it costs to grow up somewhere that never stops testing you, or what it teaches you in return. I think that's changing now, slowly. I think this whole institution is finally beginning to understand that quiet endurance is its own kind of strength, every bit as valuable as the disciplined, structured skill they've spent generations perfecting." Threll turned to look at me then, and for the first time since I had known him, his expression held nothing but genuine respect, unclouded by the doubt or dismissal that had once defined every conversation between us. "Then let us make certain," he said, "that the next cadet who arrives here carrying a quiet, unremarkable file, full of instincts nobody thought to measure properly, is met with curiosity instead of dismissal. I owe you that much, at the very least, for everything I failed to see in you when we first met." I smiled, watching the stars fully emerge over the training yard, thinking of my grandmother, of the valley I grew up in, of every quiet, unglamorous act of survival that had shaped me long before anyone here ever thought to call it something worth respecting. That, I said, would be more than enough. And together, we stood in the gathering dark, two people from entirely different worlds, finally seeing each other clearly, while somewhere far behind us, a new generation of cadets slept soundly, unaware of how much the ground beneath their feet was quietly beginning to shift.